So we do ask that you leave your microphone and your video off while the speakers are presenting, and there'll be time to turn them on if you have a question during the Q&A period. If you have any technical issues during this webinar, you can reach out to my colleague Caroline at cmiranda@cfleads.org, and she can help you troubleshoot. If we all end up having technical issues, we will switch to phone, and the phone number's here on the screen. It should be in your email confirmation, and we will email everyone on the call if we do have to switch to phone, but we haven't had any issues with Zoom so far. And just a reminder that at cfleads.org, our website, we do have all recordings from previous webinars, I think all 7 of them now, on our website under the resources section. And this webinar is also being recorded. So if you miss anything or you have to leave early, the recording will be up on our website by tomorrow. So I'm going to turn it over to Deborah to kick us off and get us started.
Thank you, Melody. And welcome, everyone. I am really, let's see here. There we go. Put my video on. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another one of our webinars in our Community Connections in Time of Crisis webinar series. We've been hosting these online forums for the past couple months for community foundations who want to come together to hear how your community foundation colleagues are navigating the coronavirus public health crisis and, of course, the economic devastation that we are really experiencing now. We started out with these webinars in early April and providing information just on a whole range of issues that in describing how community foundations were responding. But from here on out, we're going to be focusing on specific topics that are of interest to you. So it's spring here in New England, as I know in many northern states, we are so grateful to have the warm weather. And I know a number of you have had this warm weather for a long time, but I hope the sunshine and long days are lifting your spirits as you continue to work at this incredibly rapid pace to get money out the door and to work with your community to address this ongoing crisis. You know, in many of the conversations with community foundation CEOs that I've been having, I hear that you are working harder than ever. 150% effort is what I'm hearing pretty commonly. And this, of course, is on top of your caring for school-age children and your worry about elders and others who are vulnerable, and the lack of ability to engage in person with your colleagues, and of course, just the inability to give a friend a hug. So I would love if you, as we're going on here, why don't you enter into the chat what % effort you think your foundation's working at? Be really interesting to know. Are you working at 100%? Are you working 150%? Pop it in the chat. We'll get a sense of how hard you all are working. But we do really know that you are continuing to step up. And in addition to your grant making and your management of the community funds, we're seeing some remarkable op-eds in the newspapers. We're seeing blogs and other missives from community foundations that are emphasizing a number of things. One, we're seeing that you're really urging folks to focus on the most vulnerable, particularly people of color who've been hit so hard. And then second, we see you really urging a focus on the long term, that we will eventually get through this crisis, but there is a long-term focus that community foundations can bring. And then finally, the importance of rebuilding something new, to rethink the systems so that they provide more widely shared prosperity and not going back to the old ways of doing business, which we're seeing now aren't necessarily providing widespread prosperity, as I mentioned. Community foundations have been really powerful advocates for these ideas, and it's a unique role that many are playing now. So that's another thing we'd love to have you put into the chat, is if any of you have blogs or missives that if you've been sort of lifting up these kinds of messages in your communities, we'd love to see the links or send us to your websites or wherever ways we can find those and read about them. Because this is, as I say, just an incredibly important role that community foundations are playing right now. And it's really admirable that you're doing so and able to provide this perspective in this very intense environment with all these demands on your time. But in fact, the demands on your time just demonstrate how much community foundations are really needed right now, how important you are as civic in the local civic infrastructure. It just emphasizes the need for us as a field to continue building community foundations as critical problem solvers committed to the long-term betterment of community. So thank you for all you're doing and for really showing the world why community foundations matter, why you are so important in hundreds of communities across the country and across the world. So as many of you who've been with us before know, the way that this webinar works is we hear from a couple of colleagues across the country, and we try to include community foundations of all different sizes from all different types of communities, large, small, medium size. So we'll hear from 2 speakers. Then we facilitate questions and conversations, and we'd like to have it be as interactive as possible. So what we do is we suggest you type your question into the chat, and then we'll call on you. And if you can turn on your video and your sound, you can ask your question directly. And we give plenty of time to have a Q&A period. And then finally, we close out with a poem or a story that we hope will give you just a little bit of peace of mind in these very, very demanding times. So as I mentioned, today we're going to focus on one issue, and that is going to be supporting small businesses which have been really, really hurt across the country. And our 2 speakers have been bolstering businesses on Main Street for many, many years and are really knowledgeable about this topic and can provide us with a lot of insight and information into what works and what roles are most appropriate for community philanthropy. So we're really lucky to have these 2 speakers today. First, we have Diana Anderson, who is the president and CEO of the Southwest Initiative Foundation since 2001. And she has a real deep commitment to rural communities and celebrates the spirit of innovation and collaboration that defines rural communities. And she's worked tirelessly to build relationships, strategy, and infrastructure that make the foundation a trusted partner and a regional leader in southwestern Minnesota. The foundation has launched a new movement in 2016 called Grow Our Own, which is an effort to ensure all Southwest Minnesota youth can find success. She sees supporting our next generation as a long-term economic development strategy and simply the right thing to do. The Southwest Initiative Foundation is one of 6 foundations that are participating in the CF Lead's new Economic Mobility Action Network, which is being funded by the Gates Foundation with additional support from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. After we hear from Diana, we will then hear from Deb Markey, who serves as the Senior Vice President of Locus Impact Investing and helps to manage Locus consulting services for place-based philanthropic institutions like community foundations. She has over 35 years of experience working in community economic development and community philanthropy as both a faculty member and a practitioner. So together with the Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group, who many of you know, she's working to advance the practices of economic development philanthropy, again, among place-based foundations. So I will turn it over to Diana now, and welcome, and we're so glad you're here.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm really pleased to be here and appreciate these conversations really as a collegial place to exchange ideas and share our collective hopes and, quite honestly, our collective fears around our work and what's happening in our communities. So Southwest Initiative Foundation was created in 1986 in a time of crisis. The rural economy here in Minnesota was in shambles, and I remember it well. My husband and I were young farmers at the time. Southwest Initiative Foundation is one of 6 Minnesota Initiative Foundations that collectively serve all of greater Minnesota, and we were all created with support from the McKnight Foundation back in 1986. And so because of that common history and our statewide reach, we've been able to do some interesting work with statewide partners, and I'll talk about that a bit. I've been with Southwest Initiative Foundation for almost 20 years through 9/11 and the Great Recession. We've responded to natural disasters here in the Midwest. That's primarily tornadoes and floods. But this double punch of a health and an economic crisis in our rural communities that are really already under-resourced has us really scrambling to rewrite the playbook regarding disaster response. So you know, I think for all of us, it feels like we're flying the plane as we build it. And so we're learning as we go and making course corrections. Just to get the work done. I would, the next slide, Melody, please. So all 6 of the Minnesota Initiative Foundations do business financing, and we have since the beginning through an IRS ruling that accepted our position that community lending in stagnant rural economies with high poverty and unemployment rates qualified as a charitable activity. So we've been doing business financing primarily as a gap financer since 1986. And then in 2001, we also became an SBA microenterprise intermediary. So we were positioned to respond when the Department of Employment and Economic Development here in Minnesota established the Small Business Emergency Loan Program in the weeks immediately after the stay-at-home order was issued here. I think that was the 18th of March. And of course, most of our small businesses were closed. So we have a 4-person business finance team, and they did a remarkable job of playing to each other's strengths, really figuring out who could do what in the quickest way so that we could not only process more loans in 6 weeks than we might normally do in 2 years, but also to respond with empathy and humility to a like number of entrepreneurs who called but were not eligible under the terms of the program. And I think that's been probably one of the things that has been a real significant role for us in working with small businesses, is just to be an ear. There are so many different programs out there right now, and figuring out which ones to access in a time of crisis is really challenging, regardless whether you're a savvy entrepreneur or a new immigrant entrepreneur. And so just being able to listen, take the time and listen. And that's certainly been the case with our childcare work as well. And speaking of that, like many of us, we've been doing early childhood work for 17 years. And over the last several years have really focused on addressing a lack of affordable childcare in our region. So Melody, if you could tap on the next slide, thank you. Working with partners, we over the last couple of years have really focused our efforts on trying to create and retain the childcare slots that we need in our region to meet the need. That need at the start through some research we had done in partnership with the Center for Rural Policy and Development here in Minnesota was that in Southwest Minnesota, we needed 3,500 slots to fully meet the need. And over the last couple of years, working with businesses, elected officials, our nonprofit partners, we've been able to create or retain more than 1,000, and something that we feel is a great success. And then along came COVID-19 and the stay-at-home order, which took many people out of the workplace and took their children out of childcare. So the situation for our childcare providers became really precarious very quickly. The business model isn't that great, isn't that strong to begin with, and so they really don't have much of a cushion. But quickly, the governor, through executive orders, deemed essential workers needed to be able to go to work, and that childcare providers needed to care for their children. So we worked with the governor's office to really marshal philanthropy across the state of Minnesota, working with community foundations in the Twin Cities and community foundations across the region to provide that resource to our child care providers while they waited for state and federal resources to arrive. So we discussed creating a general COVID-19 response fund, but decided instead to really focus our early efforts on the childcare situation. So we applied for funds from the Minnesota Council on Foundations Relief Fund. So that's been a resource that's been coordinated statewide by MCF, and to date, I think they've raised over $11 million for response and recovery efforts. And so we received $100,000 from that fund. We also partnered with donor advisors, our unrestricted endowment donors, and the 30 community affiliates that we partner with to raise additional dollars. And then, just through reallocating resources within our own budget that weren't going to be deployed, we were able to assemble about $450,000 to grant to both home and center-based providers, really for whatever needs they had most pressing. So, some used the funds to get critical supplies. This was the time when you couldn't get toilet paper or hand sanitizer, but the state created a pipeline and they were able to buy supplies for enhanced sanitation protocols, and others simply used it to make their home mortgage payment. So within 72 hours of making a really simple application available online, we had about 550 applications. And I would say, that the success of that program really depended on the relationships, both with the governor's office, because we've had a longstanding relationship with the governor's children's cabinet, but also with the providers in the region. Almost all of the providers in our region were already in our system because of either trainings that we had offered or appreciation events that we had hosted in the past. So that really served us well in being able to get this information to them quickly and make it simple and easy for them to apply. And then the third example on the next slide, Melody, is about a partnership that we launched just this last 2 weeks with the Regional Development Commission that serves the city of Wilmer and Candy-Ojai County. So this is a joint powers entity of the city and the county that really focuses on economic development resources for businesses within the city and county. And they're really well positioned to help businesses think about the supports that are available through the SBA and the state programs. But again, as I mentioned, they can be really challenging to navigate. And we were hearing stories about how language and cultural differences were really creating barriers for our immigrant businesses, especially to successfully get access to those programs and figure them out. And that, many very small immigrant businesses who'd been shuttered due to the stay-at-home order were really facing immediate peril. And they shared the story of a Somali entrepreneur with a transport business that really was the 18-wheeler that he owned. And he was desperately needing a little bit of cash to make the insurance payment on his truck so he could keep that and be ready to get back to work when things opened up. So we provided support to make grants to those small businesses. The criteria again was very straightforward. If the business was immigrant-owned, if it had been up and running for no more than 7 years, and they could apply for $500 to $750, so very small grants. This went live last week with some publicity in the newspapers and a lot of attention on social media. And what we are hearing is that support specific to our immigrant businesses isn't always popular with our mainstream businesses because everybody is struggling mightily right now. And so, we're really seeing this, that as resources become even more scarce, there's a scarcity mindset around them, and it's creating tension when, populations that really need this support are being, singled out and supported. So, but we just know that we managed because we know that our immigrant entrepreneurs really began their business ownership journey well behind the starting line in terms of access to capital and culturally responsive technical assistance. And we also know that the immigrant businesses are really vital to our community recovery. Communities like Worthington and Wilmer, who have large new immigrant populations, have seen downtown revitalization that has solely been driven by the new immigrant-owned businesses, restaurants, salons, retail shops, and grocery stores, up and down the street. So these businesses are critical to keep in place for community vitality in the long term. So just a few things on the next slide, Melody, that I think have helped us work with the business community and respond. First and foremost is relationships. And of course, for those of us in the community foundation field, that's not rocket science. But my advice is if the relationships were not in place prior to the pandemic, now is not necessarily the time to build them. We've experienced some flops since the pandemic began by trying to work quickly in situations where we didn't have trusting relationships already in place. And unfortunately, a specific instance within one of our tribal nations. That's, the relationships have really carried the day for us in working with businesses. I'm really grateful that we took a plunge a couple of years ago and moved to the Salesforce platform. We called the early period of getting acquainted with Salesforce the Valley of Despair. But once we came through it, we were able to go paperless and work remotely. Really just on a dime. We made the decision, I think, on the 17th of March to go remote, and everybody packed up their stuff and started working remotely on the 18th. So that would have never been possible with our old technology platform. And our technology officer, it's really been pushing us to create things that we've said we wanted for a long time, but now, necessity makes it that we must. And so we just creating a very simple grant application for those childcare grants. It allowed us to process and pay out 520 grants in a really short period of time without a single piece of paper. So, I think talking to a lot of my colleagues, I know that this experience of working remotely is really going to transform the way that we work forever. And then I'm so glad that, we had funds in our budget for legal counsel as we, continue to work on new ways to support businesses. We really rely on that legal counsel to keep us on the right side of charitable activities. We were pretty confident that the child care providers and the immigrant businesses would qualify as a charitable class in this time of crisis, but we certainly would not have moved forward without written opinions from our legal counsel on that. So I know Deb Markey will talk about this, but there really is so much that can be done to support businesses right now. We're looking at capacity building grants to the agencies that support small businesses, such as chambers, the small business development services that are run by our community colleges, and local economic development organizations like the one in Wilmer and Kandiyohi County. We're really seeing now that chambers of commerce are the backbone of the business communities in our small communities, but their revenue streams have just dried up, whether it's membership dues or their summer festivals. And they are C6 membership organizations, but again, have legal guidance that allows us to make grants to those chambers if the purpose of the grant is broad community benefits. So conversations with them about how to develop language-specific guides to reopening businesses and organizations are the kinds of things that we're just pushing around with our chambers as a way to support them and to get them directly connected with the immediate needs of the businesses and the community. So with that, thanks, and I'll turn it over to Deborah and Deb.
Thank you, Diana. That was really, really helpful. It's just so nice to hear how well positioned you are to provide this kind of quick relief to the many different kinds of small businesses that you have in your community, and people might not really realize just the kind of breadth of the kind of small businesses you have. So I want to remind everyone to continue to put in the chat. Please let us know if you've written any op-eds or blogs that we can put on our own website to show the leadership in the field. And then we really are curious as to what % effort you're giving to this work. And Bonnie Geddes saying, everything I have to give. I think we've heard that a lot, Bonnie, so thank you for that, everything we have to give. But with that, I will turn it over to Deb Markey. Welcome, Deb.
Thank you, Deborah. And I'm glad to be on the webinar this afternoon. Just a word about where some of the things I'm going to share are coming from. So Locus is a nonprofit consulting organization. We work with lots of community foundations, including a number of folks on the webinar. We also sit within a community development financial institution. So like Diana, we're able to look at both sides of the capital stream, if you will. Where does philanthropy fit in? And what are the needs we're seeing on the small business and housing side of the market, which are the two areas where Virginia Community Capital, the Community Development Financial Institution we're part of, does most of their lending. So when the crisis hit, we all went home and started working remotely, as all of you did. But we also started calling foundation partners, foundations we were working with or had worked with in the past, just trusted partners to check in, to ask how they were doing, how their communities were doing, but also trying to get a sense of both the immediate response and how they were viewing their role in this crisis. Because we saw an opportunity to be able to gather some of this information and then share it back out. So it was part of the information gathering and just reassurance of the partners that we'd worked with for so long. So what I'm sharing today are some insights for community foundations at different stages in this game. But I do want to just say that the insights come from your peer foundations. So I'm channeling the voice of some of you all on the webinar and others. So I just want to give all due credit to the community foundation leaders, people like Diana, and others, because it's really you all who are working, as Bonnie said, and giving everything that you have to this challenging time. So let me start by sharing just a few insights for community foundations who never thought they'd be asking the question, how do I support small businesses? That didn't really, you may not have seen yourself taking a role in economic development. And while I absolutely agree with Diana that it's so much easier in this time of crisis to be able to gear up quickly and do the kind of work that Southwest Initiative Foundation has done. If you have all those relationships and you've stepped into this role in the past, it certainly isn't too late to start doing that. And as we talked with folks, we spent a lot of time asking, so who are you talking to? And heard a lot about folks reaching out to chambers and starting to think about whether they could make a grant to a chamber to start supporting small businesses on Main Street. So foundation leaders beginning to think a little differently about their role in economic development, and starting by just having some conversations. And while it's tough to do any of this really quickly, and it really does move at the speed of trust, and I think most of the foundations we talked to went to their economic development partners with a great deal of humility. We know that the economy is challenged and the small businesses are challenged and nonprofits are challenged. We want to figure out how to help. And I think that's in some ways is the right way to start this conversation. So I really do encourage you all to recognize that it's not too late. I think that also having those conversations with financial institutions in your community, you may not have a community development financial institution, you may have community banks, credit unions, that you can go up and say, what are your capital challenges? What would help you put more money out into the community, make more loans to small businesses, help families that are in need right now? And we know of one community foundation that had those conversations and was able to move a deposit, $1.5 million deposit into a community credit union, so that credit union had the liquidity to go and make more loans in the community. So just having those conversations, seeing where the capital is, can allow you to move into some of these roles in a small way right now in the middle of this crisis. But again, it's not too late. The other thing we heard from almost every community foundation leader that we talked to was they're recognizing the need to balance short-term response and the longer-term recovery and rebuilding that this crisis is going to present. And as Diana said, a number of community foundations said, we're not creating that rapid response fund. A lot of them did, but many said, we want to, and one leader said, I went and told my board, we need to keep our powder dry because this response is here now and we'll be a partner with others, but we need to be thinking about the recovery and rebuilding phase, which could go on for a couple of years. And how do we make sure that we have resources to bring to the table at that point in time? And I think one of the ways to think about this is almost every business as they recover, if they're fortunate enough to come through this immediate crisis, is going to have to rethink their business model, the way that they work, the way that they hire, the way that they deal with customers, and the existing ecosystem that supports them, the small business development centers and chambers and other folks that are providing technical assistance, are going to have to rethink their ways of delivering that kind of support. And so a grant to a small business development center to be able to go out and provide that kind of rebuilding recovery assistance, not financial assistance, but the knowledge and understanding of how to move into this space. So being able to provide a grant to do that, or buying Zoom licenses for a whole set of businesses that might need to go out and begin to deal with customers in a different sort of way. So that balancing act that you all have is so important, but community foundations are built for it. I mean, you bring that long-term perspective that many in your economic development community, many of your economic development partners really just don't have that generational focus on the community. So it's a really important asset, I think. The final insight for those of you who are just getting started here is that I think this crisis has helped a lot of community foundations recognize that they're going to need to use new tools to help really rebuild the communities in the years ahead. That it's going to be very challenging if we think about grant making as the only way to manage out of this crisis and rebuild out of this crisis. And so I think it is a good time to learn from foundations like Southwest Initiative Foundation, other community foundations, and there's a growing number of them that have moved into local impact investing, that have already made decisions to allocate some of their endowment toward investing locally in their community. How did they do it? What are some of the decisions that they had to make? That feels like a long-term kind of investment to make in the midst of a crisis. But I can tell you that the rebuilding part of this is going to go on long enough that you do have the opportunity to build some of those new skills and capacities. And there are going to be capital gaps out there related, and we've heard stories of money being rescinded from deals, housing related deals. There are going to be local government units of government that are increasingly going to be strapped, and there are going to be funding gaps that you might be able to step into as an investor that you could not step into as a grant maker. Making a loan to a broadband company to get internet access out into parts of your county where you just can't afford right now in the midst of this crisis to wait for a federal grant to do that. And you might need to get that kind of resource, that infrastructure out to people now before the next school year starts, before the next retail season starts for those folks. So just a few things for those of you who are just getting started. Next slide, Melody. I just want to make two comments because I know there are folks on this webinar who are taking a role in economic development and may even be doing some local investing out there. And I think that a couple of things that we've heard is those partnerships that Diana talked about are still so critical, but they might look a little bit different, I think, than in the past. And one of the ways that we're just seeing this emerge as the next wave of federal dollars comes out is that states are looking at resources through the CARES Act now, that we've heard a lot of states talking about creating small business grant funds or small business loan funds. And this could be the time for community philanthropy to begin to look at those state business loan pools and say, how could we be a partner there? And to think a little differently about the kinds of partnerships and investments that you might have made in the past. The other lesson, and this comes from the opportunity that we've had at Locus to be part of a community development financial institution. One of the things that's been so valuable for us is foundations that didn't wait for us to come to them and say, we've got some capital needs, but actively reached out to all of their investees, all of their financial partners, and said, what's it going to take for you as an organization to be able to do more lending to nonprofits, or to be able to help more nonprofits early on be part of the SBA lending program? And so we've seen foundations step up and provide grant support so that our CDFI could lower the interest that they were charging on affordable housing loans so those developers could pass the savings on to their low-income renters. And those things come through, not just through a CDFI or a community financial institution of some sort, that comes from a partnership with philanthropy. And so I would encourage those of you who are actively playing this role to really not wait to be asked, to explore what those capital needs are. One just final insight, and this reflects something that Deborah said at the beginning. I don't think there's been a single conversation that we have had with a community foundation in the midst of this crisis that hasn't lifted up the opportunity within this crisis and the urgency within this crisis to center equity in the recovery, rebuilding, and even reimagining of economic development in their communities. And we've seen this in so many different ways. Working with a foundation in California that had started to hold the space, if you will, for inclusive economic development in that community, that in the midst of the crisis has economic development partners now coming and saying, we need to be able to figure out how to do better for the Latino families in this community. and has donors coming to them to say, how do we get more resources out to minority businesses in this community? So I think there's such an important community leadership role in this crisis to center equity and to not be reluctant to put it into the conversation at every turn. You all have been dealing with the symptoms of a system that hasn't worked well for a long time. And there's a real moment in time now. I'm hearing from community foundation leaders who say, if not us, then who is going to put equity into the middle of these conversations? And I'll just end with, I won't name her because I don't want to embarrass her, but a community foundation leader who told me that one of the first conversations that she had with her board, and she's a new community foundation leader, the board was a little concerned about what's happened to our portfolio, and her response was, we have to be bold now. And I think that's the message that we've seen from community foundation leaders across the country. So I'll stop there. I'm happy as we go to questions to give more examples of things that we've heard from the field. So thank you, Deborah.
Thanks, Deb. That was really, really helpful. So if you have questions for either Diana or Deb, please type it into the chat box, or you can raise your hand, and we will call on you. You can turn your video on and turn your sound on and introduce yourself before you ask a question. So I have, I really appreciate your comments, Deb. In fact, Tony Pippa of Brookings, was on our last webinar and really emphasized this same lesson. He was talking about how they responded to Katrina and about how just incredibly important it is to act quickly and step up. And so tell us a little bit more about what that is. Is that, who do you call? What does acting quickly mean? What's the first phone call you make or respond to?
So I'll offer something, but I think that's a great question for the folks on the webinar as well. I think that, again, because there is such an important capital need out there, I think approaching your community banks, especially if you're in a smaller place where you've got some relationships with those kinds of organizations. I think because of the vulnerability of, as Diana said, of immigrants, of people of color, and being inordinately impacted in this crisis, reaching out to the community development corporations, the faith community has been in this one example in California. In the crisis, they realized where the most important leaders in that community to get out to the people of color who needed help most were to work through the faith community. And so I think really stopping to think about, are we trying to focus on capital? Then going to the banks where the money is makes a lot of sense to begin to have those conversations. But if you're really trying, as community foundations do so well, to understand the lived experience of small businesses run by people of color in disadvantaged neighborhoods in your city or your community, you need to go out into those networks, whether it's working with the faith community or others. So I'll stop there, but just a couple thoughts.
Diana, something to add?
Yeah, I think I would agree with Deb that we immediately connected with the community-led organizations in both Worthington and Wilmer that are on the ground with our new immigrant businesses. So in Worthington, that's the Chamber. They have an immigrant business subgroup that is made up of business leaders from the immigrant community. And so, very quickly, they can give us a sense of what the biggest needs in their community are. In Wilmer, it was really the Regional Development Commission who is very, very connected. And it was interesting. I think, community foundations are, as we've really stepped into this community leadership role, we made some calls right off the bat, but we got a lot of calls right off the bat too. I mean, people knew that we were positioned to partner with them. And so, just within 24 hours of the first executive orders closing things down, we were getting calls from our partners on what to do next.
Great, thank you. Now I just see a question from Max Cup. Max, do you want to put yourself on, take yourself off mute and put your video on and ask your question about, really great question about including fund holders in the equity conversation. And I know, Diana, you're thinking a lot about, what is the right narrative for a community like yours, a rural community in Minnesota. So Max, are you there? And do you want to take yourself off mute and off video if you're willing?
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, my question, and it kind of tied in
Max,
with.
tell us where you're, where you're from. Thanks.
So I'm from Pikes Peak Community Foundation out in Colorado Springs. And my question was kind of related to what you were talking about with your focus on immigrant businesses. Wondering how you bring fund holders along to have them support what you all are doing, and hopefully, turn them into advocates for the cause that you're supporting.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think one of the strategies that has been really effective for us is to really bring this forward from an economic development and a community well-being perspective. So just recognizing what immigrants contribute to our community in terms of downtown revitalization, in terms of workforce, in terms of tax base, and population growth. Rural Minnesota has been in a population decline, and that trend is still there, but it's been dramatically slowed by the immigrants that are coming in to live and work in our communities. And so when you put that positive narrative forward, it has, because we work with a lot of our donors would be, high net worth, long-standing business leaders in the community. A lot of our funders would be probably more conservative in their approach, but they really understand the economic and community benefits that new immigrants have brought to our communities. And so, it's an asset-based approach. We're really talking about immigrants in our communities as an asset. And the data bears that out. You can provide economic and just from what's happening in our schools in terms of schools being fully funded because of the student enrollments are growing. So that approach has really leveraged a lot of goodwill and brought people to the table. So we had great turnout from fund partners to help with that work.
And Max, I don't know if you're familiar with some of the work that the Community Foundation for Greater Buffalo has done, but they produced a report that sort of said equity is the better economic development strategy, and they made it from the point of economic development. If we want to grow, if we want to be vibrant, this is the better strategy. And this was sort of targeted at business people, which, as Diana says, are many of her board members. So, Deb, I don't know if you have something to add.
No, I think Diana covered it really, really well.
Thank you.
Great. So, Diana, will you talk a little bit more about your relationship with the chambers? Because you sort of pointed out that well, just elaborate a little bit on your remarks about the chambers.
Sure. There are 156 communities in Southwest Minnesota, and I would say all but the very smallest have a chamber. Many of them are volunteer run, so it's a volunteer board without paid staff, but we probably have a dozen or so chambers in our communities that have at least one paid staff person. And they really are the backbone of the business community. And they have been, I think, largely left out of the conversations around, they weren't eligible for PPP loans because of their 501c6 status. They were not, they haven't been part of the state's conversation about funding and resources. But at the same time, you know, their summer festivals and membership dues have left them really. We actually, a couple of things, we talked to some of the chambers that have paid staff about the possibility of providing some very low interest loans to them to tide them through this time. But also then just, you know, how can we partner with them to ensure that they're stable going into recovery, and that they're able to really meet the needs of communities, which right now is about business reopening. We've had, on a daily basis, I think there are new executive orders surrounding how businesses can reopen. We got hard news yesterday for restaurants for beginning June 1st, they can reopen, but patio service only. So, you know, the mom and pop restaurants on Main Street in our smallest communities are still not able to be open for business. And that's going to have a huge impact. So, you know, the chambers are working really hard with those businesses to help them figure out when it's time to reopen, what will that look like, and to comply with all of the state requirements for social distancing and sanitation and all of that. And we're working closely with them on that.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I understand Kelly Cooper has her hand raised. Kelly, do you want to take yourself off mute and ask your question? And please tell us where you're from first.
Well,
if you're still there, Kelly.
Yes, I did put my hand back down because it was kind of more in relation to Max's question. But since you saw it was up, I'll go ahead. I'm with the Albuquerque Community Foundation, and we do a lot.
Is that a real sky behind you? Is that what your sky looks like right now?
No, I would be lying. My sky really is more blue.
Okay.
That's our corporate color.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, we do a lot of work in economic development. We did call a couple of CDFIs and make $250,000 impact investments in their programs over the last couple of weeks. But one of the most interesting programs that I think we did was, and it really was because of our boots on the ground work that we've been doing in all of the really diverse neighborhoods. I had one of our donor advised fund holders, who is actually 5 local businessmen who do a large annual fundraiser, and they've grown a fund at the Community Foundation. They called really, really early in all of this and said, we've got to step up. What should we fund? Where should we go with this? And this was right before the first CARES Act was finalized. Our state was throwing $1 million around. Our city was. There was just lots and lots of big investment, emergency action type funds that were being talked about. So I started to aggregate them and think about, where could my donor advised fund dollars go that would be more impactful than another $100,000 in a $2 million fund or a $2 trillion fund? So what we wound up doing was funding the diverse economic development centers that we already know. We already had trusted relationships with them. So we gave grants to all of them and said, start working with your businesses. to get, we don't know what the documents are going to be required, but let's start getting organized. Well, literally, and that would be our South Valley Economic Development Center, which is a high Latino population, international district, which was formerly known as the war zone. It's where our immigrants and our refugees are. We do a lot of work through those economic development centers, and Native Women Lead, another one working with that population. So we got all organized, we did online trainings, we scaled them up. That PP program came and went. Nobody had a shot, nobody had a chance on getting in. So we were so, so disappointed in all of those things. Well, long story short, we thought with all of the rumblings that we're starting to hear, the government will have to do something else. So let's go forth with our program, assuming that there will be opportunities. So we did do that. So those 3 organizations continue to work with those nonprofits. But on the other end of it, we knew that we had to find somebody who would process the loans. The banks, as we all know, were not taking unbanked customers. They weren't looking for anybody to support other than their customers that had long-term relationships with them. So we just straight up used our board influence and started calling bank presidents, CDFIs, and saying, will you take 20 loans? Will you process 10? Will you do? So we got everybody to kind of a cumulative agree to do that. So we were able to fill that niche too. So the program has gone so far, it may sound small, but 60 applications have now been filed. I truly don't believe any of them would have been filed had we not initiated this program. So anyway, I think that is taking a donor advised fund and limited dollars and really them for, we call it Project Preserve. So
yeah, what a way to extend that. Diana, do you have any reaction to that? That's fantastic.
Yeah, that is, I think that, again, being able to leverage those, bridge those relationships that you have, it's really a role that you can play as that connector between what your donors care deeply about or know needs to be done and the agencies that are really doing that work on the ground, and then being innovative. And I think, just as my final thought would be, I completely agree with this idea that we have to be bold, but I would also say that, we're going to take risks and we're going to fail at some of this, because again, we're building the plane as it's flying. And so we're going to try stuff and it isn't going to have the desired outcome. And as, learning organizations, we're gonna have to be okay with that. It's just the nature.
What a great reminder.
Yeah. The nature of crisis response. We are going to be able to figure it all out before we act. That's the speed, need for speed. Yeah.
Deb, any last comments for you before we turn it over to Len to close us out with a poem?
The only thing that Diana's comment made me want to just give a little shout out to all of your boards that are supportive of you all stepping into this community leadership role in the midst of crisis, and recognize, Diana, as you said, that things are going to get messed up at times, but we've had lots of conversations recently, and those boards have been so supportive. And I think you ought to give a shout out to you for your leadership, but also your boards for having your backs.
Yeah, right on. Absolutely. So I'm going to turn it over to Len Bartel at CF Leads. We will see you in 2 weeks. Remember, we're doing this every 2 weeks now, and we'll focus on a particular topic. We're deciding between a couple, and we'll let you know as soon as possible. Thanks again so much for all you're doing, for the 150% or all you can give. We're really, really grateful to you as Community Foundation. So I'll turn it over to you, Len, for our poem. And thanks so much to Deb and Diana. Really, really grateful for you taking this time out of this incredibly busy time. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you so much for your comments today. And I think today this is less a poem and more just a brief reading. This is an excerpt from a piece that Arundhati Roy wrote just after this pandemic started, and titled "The Pandemic is a Portal." And I think it really speaks to what Deb mentioned in her last slide around this is an opportunity to be able to reimagine a future in our communities that are equitable. And I quote, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." So thank you for all that you're doing in your communities to fight for a more equitable future as we enter into this long recovery and rebuild within our communities. And as Deborah said, and as Melanie put up on the screen, we'll see you back here in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.